The morning Joel Warren rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, not a single soul on the main street turned to look at him, and that was the story of his life told in one quiet moment. He was 26 years old and had the kind of face that was easy to forget, not because it was unpleasant to look at, but because it carried no hunger for attention, no sharp edge of pride that made a man demand to be noticed. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends when the weather turned humid, and eyes the color of old copper, not gold, not brown, something in between that never quite caught the light in a way that made people stop and stare. He was tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate simply, and his hands were calloused from years of work that had never belonged entirely to him. He wore a gray shirt, worn at the collar, and a hat that had seen better years, and he rode a bay mare named Clover, who was the most loyal companion he had ever had in his life, which said something painful about the nature of that life. Joel had grown up on a failing cattle ranch 40 miles east of Dodge City, the second son of a man who barely remembered he had 2 sons instead of 1. His older brother, Daniel, had been the kind of boy who filled every room he entered, loud and golden-haired and full of stories, the kind of son a father looked at and felt proud without knowing exactly why. Joel had simply been the other one, the one who fixed the fences before anyone noticed they were broken, the one who stayed up with the sick cattle and said nothing about it in the morning, the one who kept the accounts accurate and the pantry stocked and the horses shod, and who received in return a vague nod and the assumption that things had somehow taken care of themselves. When his father died in the winter of 1878, he had left the ranch entirely to Daniel, who had run it into the ground within 18 months and then sold what remained for drinking money. Joel had not been angry, exactly. He had been something quieter and harder to name, the feeling of a man who realizes that the world has not been unkind to him so much as it has simply not registered his presence at all. He had packed his things into 2 saddlebags, kissed Clover on the nose, and ridden west, telling himself that somewhere out there was a place that needed what he had to offer, even if no one had bothered to notice what that was yet. He had drifted for 4 years. He had worked cattle drives up from Texas to the Kansas railheads, where the trail bosses learned his name only because he was reliably there every morning before sunrise, never missing a shift, never losing a head of cattle, never asking for more than his agreed wages. He had done a season of fence repair for a landowner in Oklahoma Territory who had spoken to him exactly 3 times the entire summer and had paid him without looking up from his ledger. He had spent a winter in Wichita doing odd jobs, and though he had lived in the same boarding house for 4 months, the landlady had still sometimes looked at him with mild surprise when he appeared at the dinner table, as though she had forgotten she'd rented him a room. He was not a ghost. He knew that. He breathed and bled and felt things with a depth that sometimes frightened him, because all that feeling had nowhere to go. He had opinions about things, strong ones, the kind a man grows when he spends a great deal of time alone with his thoughts. He had a sense of humor that surfaced sometimes in the dark when no one was listening, dry and quiet and precise. He could read better than most men he'd ever met, having taught himself from whatever books came his way, and he could do figures in his head faster than some men could do them on paper. None of it had ever mattered to anyone who mattered to him. Caldwell was a cattle town, sitting just north of the Kansas Indian Territory border, and in 1882 it was still kicking with the energy of the cattle trade, though Dodge City to the west got all the stories in the newspapers. Joel had come here because a man at a campfire 3 weeks ago had mentioned that the Harlan Ranch east of town was looking for a reliable hand, something about a foreman who'd left things in disarray. Joel figured he could fix disarray. It was about the only thing the world had ever let him practice long enough to get good at. He stopped at the general store first, because Clover needed a new shoe nail that had been working loose, and he needed salt and a length of rope. The store smelled of tobacco and dried beans and something sweetly chemical that he eventually identified as the new batch of soap bars stacked near the front window. The man behind the counter, stout and red-faced, took his order without once making eye contact, shouted at someone in the back, handed Joel his items, took his coins, and turned away. Joel thanked him and meant it and received nothing in return. He rode out toward the Harlan Ranch with the sun climbing higher and the Kansas prairie opening up around him in that particular way it had in spring, when the grass was just greening and the sky looked freshly washed and impossibly wide. It was the kind of landscape that could make a man feel very small or very free, depending on what he carried inside him. Joel had long since decided to choose the latter, even when it cost him something. The Harlan property was marked by a gate made of rough-cut timber, with the ranch brand burned into a plank above it, two parallel lines with a slanted bar through them, like a letter H with ambitions. Beyond it, the land rolled gently downward toward a creek, and the main house sat on a modest rise with barns and outbuildings arranged around it, with the practical logic of people who'd been working the land long enough to know what needed to be close to what. Joel pulled Clover up just before the gate and took in the scene with the unhurried assessment he'd learned to make before entering any new situation. Two ranch hands were repairing a corral fence on the near side of the barns. An older man with a gray beard was examining something in the bed of a wagon near the house. A dog of indeterminate breed sat in a patch of sunlight doing nothing at all with great contentment. And then, across the wide field that ran south of the main barn, there was a woman. She was maybe 50 yards from him, on the other side of the split-rail fence that marked the field's edge, and she was standing with a rope coiled over one shoulder and a look of focused, unhurried determination on her face, as she approached a young horse that was making clear it did not wish to be approached. The horse was a gray, probably 2 years old, skittish in that particular way of animals that have not yet decided whether the world is trustworthy, and the woman was doing everything correctly, keeping her body sideways, not looking directly at the horse, moving in a slow arc that gradually reduced the distance without triggering flight. She knew what she was doing. Joel could see that from where he sat. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with chestnut hair pinned up loosely under a wide-brimmed hat, and a few strands had come free in the breeze. She wore a practical split skirt and a white shirtwaist with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she moved with the kind of easy, grounded confidence that came from a person being entirely comfortable in their own body and their own purpose. She was not beautiful in the way that made men stupid, though she was certainly that too. She was beautiful in the deeper way, the way of a person who had substance behind their face, weight and history and intelligence in every line of them. Joel was about to click his tongue and ride through the gate when the woman stopped. She turned her head and she looked directly at him. Not the way people sometimes happen to glance at a person passing on the road. She looked at him with a deliberate, unhurried attention, the way you look at something that has genuinely caught your interest, and she did not look away. She held his gaze across that wide stretch of spring grass for a moment that felt longer than it probably was, and Joel felt something shift inside him that he could not immediately name, something like the ground settling after a small tremor, everything rearranging itself into a new configuration. Then the gray horse took advantage of her distraction and trotted smartly to the far end of the field, and the woman turned back to her task with what might have been a small, rueful smile at her own lapse. Joel sat still for another second, his hand loose on the reins, and then he rode through the gate toward the house. The gray-bearded man in the yard turned out to be a ranch hand named Pete, who told him that the ranch owner was Frank Harlan, that Frank was in the house, and that the woman in the south field was Frank's niece, Julia Doyle, who had come out from St. Louis 6 months ago and shown no signs of leaving, which Pete seemed to regard as one of the better things that had happened to the Harlan property in some time. "She know horses?" Joel asked because he was thinking about what he'd seen. Pete gave him a look. She knows horses better than most men I've worked with, and I've worked with a considerable number. Frank was going to sell that gray colt because nobody could get near him. Julia's got him eating out of her hand, more or less." He paused. "Today's a setback," he added, watching the distant field where the gray horse was now standing at the far fence looking superior about itself. Frank Harlan was 61 years old, weathered and plain-spoken, with the kind of handshake that told you immediately what kind of man you were dealing with. He hired Joel after approximately 12 minutes of conversation because, as he put it, "You answer questions straight and you don't try to make yourself sound better than you are, and that tells me more about a man than any list of references." Joel was to start the following morning, handle general ranch management, help with the spring cattle inventory, and work on whatever needed fixing, which, as Frank made clear, was a considerable list. He was given a bunk in the small room at the back of the foreman's quarters, which was its own outbuilding, and he was told supper was at 6 and punctuality was appreciated. Frank Harlan ran a tidy operation with clear expectations, and Joel had the immediate feeling of a man who has found solid ground after a long time walking on uncertain terrain. He spent the rest of that first afternoon unloading his saddlebags, tending to Clover in the barn, and walking the perimeter of the immediate property to get a sense of what he was working with. He did not see Julia Doyle again that day, but he found himself, in the corner of his awareness, listening for the sound of her returning from the south field, which was a new thing for him, and one he did not entirely know what to do with. Supper was served in the main house kitchen by a woman named Rosa who cooked for the household, and had the efficient, benevolent authority of someone who had long ago established that her domain was her domain, and everyone else was a guest in it. There were 6 people at the long kitchen table: Frank, Rosa, Pete, 2 other hands named Cal and August, and Julia Doyle, who sat across from Joel and 2 seats down and apparently felt no particular need to make conversation with anyone she did not feel like making conversation with. She spoke when she had something to say, and listened the rest of the time with the alert, thoughtful quality of a person who actually processes what they hear. She asked Frank a question about the gray colt's bloodline that led to a 10-minute discussion about the horse's dam and sire, and what that might mean for his eventual temperament. She told August, who had mentioned a sore wrist, that her father had sworn by a poultice of beeswax and comfrey for tendon trouble, and she would make him some if he wanted it. She ate her cornbread with evident satisfaction. Once, during a lull in conversation, she looked up and caught Joel watching her, and again she did that thing. She simply held his gaze level and calm, without embarrassment or coyness, just looking, as though she found him genuinely interesting and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Joel, who was not a man who flushed easily, felt heat rise in the back of his neck. He looked down at his plate and told himself he was being ridiculous. After supper, Frank showed Joel the account books for the ranch, which were in a state of moderate chaos following the previous foreman's departure, and they spent an hour at the table going through figures. Frank was sharp with numbers himself but said he didn't have the patience for the record-keeping, and Joel worked through the books with the focused pleasure of a man doing something he was genuinely good at, straightening out columns and noting discrepancies and organizing the forward projections for the spring cattle sales. "You've done this kind of work before," Frank said. It was not quite a question. "On my father's ranch mostly," Joel said, "and on my own since. I kept my own accounts on the drives. Most cowboys don't bother with that. I like knowing where I stand," Joel said simply. Frank studied him for a moment. "Fair enough," he said. The next morning Joel was up before dawn because that was how he operated, and he was doing a fence check along the east pasture when the sun came up properly and turned the whole Kansas horizon the color of embers. He heard footsteps in the dewy grass behind him and turned to find Julia Doyle approaching with 2 tin mugs of coffee, walking with the easy stride of someone who rose early by choice rather than obligation. "Rosa makes it strong," she said, holding one mug out to him. Fair warning. I prefer it that way, he said, and took it. She stood beside him and looked at the fence line he'd been checking, then at the horizon, then at him. She was wearing her hat again, and the early light was doing something interesting to the color of her eyes, which were a kind of hazel that shifted between green and brown depending on what the sky was doing. She appeared to have no difficulty whatsoever with silence, which Joel found remarkable because most people treated silence like an emergency. "I saw you ride in yesterday," she said after a while, "before I lost hold of the gray. You were doing everything right up until then," he said. She gave him a sideways look that contained something that might have been surprise and something that was definitely amusement. Most people would be polite and pretend they hadn't noticed the horse ran off. "I'm not much for pretending," he said. "Neither am I," she said. She sipped her coffee. "He's coming around, though, the gray. His name is Atlas, for all that he doesn't seem to carry any particular weight of dignity at the moment. I'll have him reliable inside of 6 weeks." "How long have you been working with horses?" he asked. She thought about it. "My whole life, more or less. My father kept them back in Missouri before we moved to St. Louis. He was better with them than with anything else he put his hand to, and he taught me what he knew." A small pause. "He died 2 years ago. My mother passed when I was 12. When my father died, I thought about staying in St. Louis, but there wasn't much there that was genuinely mine. Frank is my father's brother. He wrote and said he had more land than hands and more work than sense, and I thought that sounded like an honest offer, so I came." Joel looked at her. She had offered all of that with a directness that was not performance. She was not trying to seem brave or unbothered. She simply was those things, or had at least made her peace with the facts of her life. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in the same way he'd said it, without ceremony, genuinely. They finished their coffee as the sun continued to climb and the prairie lit up in stages around them, and then they went to their respective work without making a particular event of having stood together in the morning quiet. And yet something about it settled into Joel's chest like a warm stone and stayed there all day. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Joel found deeply satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with Julia Doyle, and also everything to do with her, in a way he wasn't quite ready to examine directly. He put the ranch's accounts in proper order within the first week, earning Frank's quiet but evident respect. He organized the spring cattle count and identified 2 additional grazing areas east of the creek that hadn't been properly utilized, which Frank said he'd been meaning to look into for 2 years. He fixed 4 sections of fencing, rebuilt the tack room shelves that had been sagging dangerously, and diagnosed a water flow problem in the main barn that had been causing a slow but steady rot in one of the support beams. The other hands, Pete, Cal, and August, accepted him with the practical ease of working men who judge each other by usefulness rather than conversation. He did what he said he would do, he didn't complain, and he never tried to make himself look better by making someone else look worse. By the end of the second week, Pete had started stopping by in the evenings to sit on the foreman's porch and talk, which for Pete mostly meant he talked and Joel listened, which suited both of them fine. And every morning, if the weather permitted, Julia came out with 2 mugs of coffee and found wherever he was working, and they stood together for a little while before the day got loud. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they were quiet. She told him about St. Louis, which she had found beautiful and suffocating in equal measure, the lovely brick buildings and the river and the bookshops she loved, and also the way women there were expected to narrow themselves into shapes determined by drawing rooms, and the opinions of men whose own shapes were not particularly impressive. She told him about Atlas's daily progress, which was considerable and described with the detailed pride of a person who genuinely loves what they're doing. She asked him questions about the cattle drives that showed she had been thinking carefully about the economics of the land and what would make the ranch more viable. Joel told her things he had not told anyone, because there had never been anyone to tell. He told her about the 4 years of drifting and what it had taught him, which was both everything and nothing. He told her that he had read Don Quixote twice in a bunkhouse in Oklahoma and thought about it still. He told her that he thought the cattle trade was going to change significantly over the next decade as the railheads pushed further south and the long drives became less necessary, and that Frank should think about selective breeding rather than sheer volume. She listened to all of it the same way she listened to everything, with real attention, the kind that made a person feel that what they were saying actually mattered. He was careful, in those early weeks, not to let himself believe too much in what he was feeling. He had no experience with this, with a woman who actually saw him, who turned toward him as naturally as a plant toward light, who seemed genuinely curious about the specific contents of his mind, and not just his ability to be useful. He knew how to be invisible, and some stubborn part of him kept waiting for the moment when Julia Doyle would look through him the way everyone else eventually had. That moment did not come. It was a Saturday in late April, almost a month after he'd arrived, when things shifted. Frank had gone to Caldwell for the day to deal with some business at the stock agent's office, and Pete and Cal had taken the wagon out to a section of northern fence that needed significant work, and August had ridden south to check on the cattle in the lower pasture. Joel was in the barn, replacing a section of flooring that had gone soft, when he heard the commotion from the south field, a sharp crack followed by a clatter, and then, faintly, a frustrated sound that was very nearly a word he probably wasn't supposed to know she knew. He put down his tools and walked out to find that Atlas had been spooked by something, a gopher hole, maybe, or a pheasant in the long grass, and had come down on his front leg wrong and then shied sideways into the field fence, breaking one of the rails. Julia was on the ground. She had apparently been thrown clear rather than caught under the horse, which was lucky, and she was sitting up, which was also lucky, but she was holding her right wrist against her chest, and the set of her jaw told him the wrist was not happy. Atlas was standing 20 feet away looking guilty and distressed in the particular way of horses who know they've done something wrong and aren't sure what to do about it. "Don't fuss," Julia said immediately as Joel crossed the field toward her, because she had looked up and seen his face and evidently read something in it she wanted to head off. "I'm not fussing," he said evenly and crouched down beside her. "Let me see. It's fine. It might be fine. Julia." He said her name for the first time in that direct way. Not Miss Doyle, not ma'am, just her name, and she looked at him, and for once let him see past the capable surface to something younger and more tired underneath, and she offered him her wrist. It was swollen and beginning to bruise, and when he very carefully felt along the bones, she drew a sharp breath at a specific point that told him what he needed to know. "It might be cracked," he said, "or badly sprained. Either way, it needs wrapping tight and resting, and you should see the doctor in Caldwell." Frank took the wagon. "Clover can carry too," he said. She looked at him steadily for a moment. There was something working in her face, not reluctance exactly, but the particular calculation of a person who is used to managing everything themselves, reassessing whether that is actually necessary in the present moment. Then she nodded once and let him help her to her feet. He got her up on Clover and then mounted behind her, his arms around her to take the reins, and they rode the 4 miles into Caldwell at a careful pace. She sat in front of him without complaint, but also without putting any more distance between them than she had to. And the ride had a warm, close quality to it that Joel did his best not to think about too carefully, while simultaneously being entirely unable to think about anything else. The doctor in Caldwell, a precise little man named Dr. Beaumont, confirmed that one of the small bones in her wrist was cracked but not badly enough to require setting, wrapped it firmly, told her to keep it still for 2 weeks, and looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who did not for a moment expect her to actually do this. Joel tied Clover outside the doctor's office, and then walked with Julia to the general store to pick up the arnica Dr. Beaumont had recommended. And because it was noon and neither of them had eaten since early morning, He steered her toward the small lunch counter at the back of the Caldwell Hotel without quite asking if that was all right, and she sat down on the stool without protest. They ate ham sandwiches and drank very mediocre coffee, and talked the way people talk when they have been through something slightly frightening together, and the adrenaline is settling back down. Julia told him about the first time she'd been thrown from a horse. She was 9. The horse was a stubborn roan mare named Gertrude, and she'd gotten right back up and gotten back on, which her father had said was the only sensible thing to do. Joel told her about the time on a cattle drive when he'd had to swim a flooding river on horseback and had been convinced for approximately 45 seconds that both he and Clover were going to drown. "Were you scared?" she asked. "Terrified," he said. "But afterwards I felt very awake, very present, like the world had sharpened into something real." She looked at him with those shifting hazel eyes. "That's exactly how I feel when I get thrown," she said quietly. "Not the falling part, afterwards, when you realize you're all right. Like permission to be alive," he said, and then felt slightly foolish for saying it. But she nodded with the solemn emphasis of someone who recognizes a truth being spoken. "Like permission to be alive. Yes." On the ride home, with her sitting against him and the afternoon light going gold across the endless Kansas grass, Joel allowed himself, carefully and provisionally, to believe that something was happening between them that was real. That it was not just the loneliness of a man who had been invisible so long that any kind attention felt enormous. That she was not kind to him out of proximity or politeness, but because she had looked at him and found something there worth looking at. The thought was so unfamiliar and so large that he had to set it aside for later, like a letter you know contains important news and need to read somewhere quiet. Frank came home that evening to find Julia's wrist wrapped and Joel's careful explanation of the day's events, and his response was practical and fond in the way of a man who loves his niece and trusts the people he's hired. He told Julia she would rest the wrist or deal with him, and he told Joel that he'd handled things well, and that was that. May unfolded soft and warm, and the ranch hummed with the productive energy of a place being properly managed, which gave Joel a deep and uncomplicated satisfaction that he hadn't felt anywhere he'd worked before. Atlas was coming along beautifully under Julia's patient handling. She worked him one-handed for the first week of her recovery, the rope held in her left hand, her cracked wrist tucked against her side, and she had him reliably leading and accepting a blanket on his back by the middle of the month. Joel watched sometimes from a distance, from the fence or the barn doorway, and thought that he could watch her work a horse forever and consider it time well spent. The evenings began to change. Instead of the coffee in the morning routine alone, Julia started appearing on the foreman's porch in the evenings too, sometimes with a book, sometimes just to sit. Joel was not sure when this became an established thing rather than an occasional one, but somewhere in the second week of May, he realized that he had started expecting her, and that when she appeared the day felt finished in a way it hadn't when she didn't. They talked about books most often. Julia had brought a small library with her from St. Louis, crammed into a trunk that Frank had grumbled about, and then silently been grateful for because she had pressed several of them on him over the winter, and he had read them all. She had Middlemarch, and a battered copy of Great Expectations, and a book of Whitman's poetry that she had dog-eared extensively. Joel had his Don Quixote and a copy of Thoreau's Walden that he'd found in a Wichita bookshop, and which had spoken to him with the uncomfortable precision of a book that knows exactly who is reading it. He left the woods eventually, Julia said one evening, about Thoreau, with the thoughtful tone of someone who has been quietly arguing with a book. Said he had other lives to live, but he never quite explains what those other lives turned out to be. Maybe the point was the leaving as much as the staying, Joel said. She considered this. The evening light was doing its particular long golden work on everything, and the prairie to the south of them was humming with insects and the occasional night bird. "I think the point," she said slowly, is that a person can choose the life they want instead of just inheriting the one that falls to them by accident. That's what I took from it anyway. She paused. Is that why you left your father's ranch? He had not told her the whole of that story, but she had gathered enough of it from pieces. I didn't leave, he said honestly. There was nothing to leave. My brother inherited it and then lost it, and I was already not quite part of it to begin with. He looked out at the horizon. I spent a long time wondering if I'd done something wrong, if there was some way I'd failed to make myself necessary, visible. Visible, she repeated, as though the word surprised her. To anyone who mattered, he said. There was a silence between them that was very different from the comfortable silences they'd been sharing. This one had weight to it, and Julia turned toward him slightly on the porch step, and he could feel her looking at him with that particular quality of attention she had, the kind that did not slide over the surface of a thing but pressed gently until it understood what was underneath. I saw you, she said. The first day, before you even came through the gate. I was working Atlas and I just felt that I should look up, and I did, and there you were, and I thought. She stopped, seeming to weigh whether to continue. What? He said quietly. I thought, that man is trying not to take up space, she said. And I thought it was the saddest and most interesting thing I'd seen in a long time. Because I could see even from that distance that there was a great deal of him, and he was holding all of it in like it might not be wanted. Joel was very still. The evening light moved across the porch. Clover shifted in her stall in the barn, and the familiar sound of it was good and grounding. I saw you, Julia said again simply, and she reached out with her unwrapped hand and put it over his where it rested on his knee, not urgently or dramatically, just clearly, the way she did everything. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while as the sky went dark and the stars came out over the Kansas prairie, enormous and close and uncountable. And Joel thought that this specific moment, this hand in his, this woman who had looked at him and not looked away, was the most real thing that had ever happened to him. In early June, a man named Cray Dunmore rode into the Harlan property and made Frank a purchase offer on a strip of land along the South Creek that Frank had no particular intention of selling. Dunmore was a land agent representing a cattle consortium out of Wichita that was buying up properties between the Kansas border and the Indian Territory, and he had the smooth, deliberate cordiality of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through the application of persistent pressure, dressed up as friendliness. Frank said no at the first meeting, politely. Dunmore went away and came back 2 weeks later with a higher offer, and a vaguely worded remark about how difficult it was becoming for small ranches to compete in the current market, which Frank correctly interpreted as a mild threat and took offense at, though he did not say so. He said no again, and Dunmore left again, and the third time he appeared, Joel was in the yard when the buggy came up the road, and he watched the man climb down with the careful reading of character that 4 years of drifting and working among strangers had made second nature to him. Dunmore was not a violent man. Joel could see that clearly enough. He was the kind of danger that worked slowly and legally, through leverage and patience, and the thing he was leveraging, Joel figured out over the course of the third conversation, was the fact that Frank Harlan was getting on in years and had no sons, and the South Creek property was, in Dunmore's estimation, the key to controlling water access in that section of the county. If Dunmore's consortium owned that creek access, they owned the economic viability of every small ranch within 5 miles. Joel said nothing during that meeting, standing quietly at the edge of the yard as he'd been repairing a spoke on the wheel of the supply wagon. But afterward, when Dunmore had gone and Frank came to find him with the look of a man who is slightly overwhelmed by something and is trying to work out what to do with it, Joel was ready with what he'd been thinking. The consortium is buying east to west, he said. They want a continuous corridor of land from here to the border. The Calhoun place east of you is already sold. I heard that from Pete in town last week. If Dunmore gets your South Creek strip, he boxes in the Henderson property to your southeast, and they'll have no choice but to sell too. And then there's nothing between the consortium's corridor and the territory line. Frank sat down on the wagon wheel hub and rubbed his face. What do I do about it? Talk to Henderson, Joel said. If you and Henderson agree not to sell, and you can get one other property, the Marsh homestead north of the creek, maybe, to join you, Dunmore can't complete his corridor. He needs all three to make it work. Without all three, it's not worth what his backers paid for the Calhoun place. Frank looked at him steadily. You figured all that out from 3 conversations with a land agent. I listened carefully, Joel said. Frank smiled slowly. It was not a common occurrence, that smile, and when it appeared it was genuine. Come with me to see Henderson, he said. He knows me, but he doesn't trust me, for reasons that go back a long time that I won't bore you with. He might listen better if there's someone else making the case. They rode east the following morning, and Joel laid out the situation for Tobias Henderson, a weathered, suspicious man in his 50s, who had very good reasons for his suspiciousness, having been lied to by several different parties over the past decade. And he laid it out plainly, and without any of the rhetorical dressing up that Henderson had learned to be wary of. He showed him the figures he'd worked out on the back of a piece of paper, the land values and the water access logic, and what losing that creek corridor would mean for both of their grazing rights over the next 5 years. Henderson listened without speaking, asked 2 very sharp questions, and then looked at Frank and said, Your new man here is either the straightest talker I've met in 20 years or a very sophisticated kind of con, and I've met enough of both to think I can tell the difference. I'll talk to Marsh. They rode home with the framework of an agreement, and by the end of June, all 3 ranches had presented a united front to Dunmore that made his corridor plan economically unworkable, and Dunmore went back to Wichita to look for a different route. Frank shook Joel's hand with a grip that said considerably more than the few words he offered, and Joel felt the particular satisfaction of having been genuinely useful in a way that was recognized and named. That evening, when Julia appeared on the porch, she already knew the story because Frank had told it at supper with an emphasis that had made Pete and Cal and August look at Joel with the comfortable respect of men revising their estimate of someone upward. Frank says you saved the ranch, she said, sitting down beside him. Frank is generous, Joel said. I just looked at the map and did the arithmetic. Joel. She said his name the way he'd said hers that day in the South Field, direct and clear. Let someone give you credit, he looked at her. She was watching him with the expression she had when she decided something needed to be said, and she was going to say it without softening it into something that wouldn't land. It's difficult, he said honestly. I know, she said gently. But you're here, you matter here, you've mattered here from the first week, and it will not be the death of you to know it. He held her gaze and felt something inside him, that old habit of contraction, of making himself small enough to be forgotten before he could be dismissed, loosen its grip slightly. Just slightly. But it was something. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said, and leaned her shoulder against his, and they stayed like that while the stars came out. July arrived with the particular violence that Kansas summers could achieve, heat pressing down on everything with a weight that made even the cattle sluggish and bad-tempered. The creek ran lower, and Joel renegotiated the grazing rotation to keep the cattle out of the southern pastures during the hottest part of the day, moving them up to the cooler northern grass in the mornings and back only in the evenings. Atlas, now reliably halter-trained and beginning his first lessons under a light saddle, turned out to have the elegant, level-headed temperament of a good working horse, once he decided the world was not trying to kill him, which Julia regarded as a personal triumph that she was entirely correct to regard that way. The shift between Joel and Julia had been happening gradually, the way rivers change course, slowly and then all at once, and afterward it seems obvious that it was always going to go that way. The shoulder-leaning had become a natural part of the evening porch sessions. He had begun unconsciously saving the interesting thoughts he had during the day to tell her in the evenings, which was something he had never done before, had never had reason to do before. She had taken to leaving a book on the porch railing for him when she finished one she thought he should read, and there was always a note tucked inside, not long, just a line or two about what she'd thought of it. And Joel kept those notes in the inside pocket of his coat, and was aware that this was probably a fact about himself that he would have found embarrassing if he had any real capacity to be embarrassed about Julia Doyle. It was Pete who said something first, because Pete was observant in the uncomplicated way of a man who liked people and paid attention to them without any particular agenda. He and Joel were mending a section of east fence in the third week of July when Pete said, apropos of nothing very much, "Julia ever talked to you about what she's planning to do long-term?" Joel kept his eyes on the fencing wire. "No," he said. "Not in particular." "She's not going back to St. Louis," Pete said. "She told Frank back in March, when I think he was still hoping she might decide ranch life wasn't for her and go back to being comfortable somewhere. She said this was where she wanted to be." He paused. "I think Frank was relieved, actually. He's getting older and he doesn't like to admit it, and having her here gives him a reason to think the place will be all right after he's gone." Joel said nothing, but his hands were slightly less steady on the wire than they'd been a moment ago. "She's a remarkable woman," Pete said, with the simple plainness of an obvious statement. "I've worked here 8 years and I've never met anyone quite like her. She says what she means and she means what she says, and she works harder than men half again her size." He paused again. "She lights up when she's talking to you, though. I don't think she knows she does it, but she does." Joel looked at him then, and Pete had the philosophical expression of a man who has delivered his information and is not going to push it further, which Joel appreciated. He thought about it for the rest of the day, turning it over carefully the way you turn over a piece of land you're considering, looking at it from different angles, testing where the ground is solid. That evening, instead of waiting for Julia to come to the porch, he knocked on the main house door and asked Rosa if Julia was in, and Rosa gave him the look that people give when they already know a great deal more than they let on, and said she'd get her. Julia came to the door with a slight surprise in her face that was pleasant to see. "Joel, would you walk with me?" he said, "if you have a little time." She looked at him for a moment with that steady appraisal, reading whatever was in his face, and then she got her hat from the hook by the door and came out. They walked south toward the field where Atlas had his paddock now, and the July evening was hot even after sunset, but the breeze had picked up and the grass was moving in long, slow waves. Atlas came to the fence when he heard Julia's footsteps and pushed his gray nose over the rail, and she rubbed it absently while Joel stood beside her trying to find the arrangement of words he'd been rehearsing in his head since this afternoon. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to say it straight, because that seems like the right way to do it with you." She turned and looked at him, and she was listening with her whole self, the way she always listened. "I have never," he paused, sorted through the sentence, "found the version that was true. I have never in my life had someone look at me the way you look at me, see me the way you do. I have spent most of my life being, I don't know, overlooked, not through anyone's cruelty particularly, just overlooked, and I had gotten used to it, I think. I had started to believe that there was something essentially invisible about me, something that made me easy for people to look through." He looked out at the darkening field. "And then you looked up from that field on the day I rode in and you didn't look away. And every day since then you've done the same thing. You've looked at me like I'm someone worth looking at." The breeze moved between them and Atlas snorted softly. "Joel," Julia said. "I'm not finished," he said. "I want to say this properly." He turned to face her fully. "I am deeply in love with you. I did not expect to be, and I'm not entirely sure when it happened, but there it is, and I would rather say it plainly and have you tell me honestly how you feel about it than carry it around quietly until it turns into something I can't manage." Julia was very still. Atlas moved his nose against her shoulder, but she didn't react. She was looking at Joel with something in her face that was complicated and full of feeling, and after a moment she reached up and took his face in her hands, which surprised him enormously. and she said, "Joel Warren, I have been trying to give you approximately 6 different clear signals that I am also deeply in love with you, and I was beginning to wonder if you were going to make me actually say it first." He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, the kind that comes from somewhere uncomplicated, and she was smiling at him with everything in her face open and honest and entirely present, and he put his hands over hers where they held his face, and then he kissed her, gently and then not so gently, there in the July evening with the Kansas grass moving around them and Atlas observing from over the fence with equine dignity. And it was, without any competition whatsoever, the best moment of his life to date. They were not people who made things complicated by being coy about what they wanted, and so they did not spend months in uncertainty after that evening. They were seen at the supper table the following morning with an ease between them that had always been there, but now had a different quality to it. And Pete caught Joel's eye and nodded once with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has bet on the right outcome, and Joel felt warmth all the way through him. Frank, characteristically, said nothing for 2 days and then called Joel into the house and offered him coffee and said, without preamble, "My niece is the most important person in the world to me, and she is also a grown woman who makes her own decisions, and I would not presume to interfere in either direction. I will say only this. If you treat her badly, I will know about it before you've finished the thought, and I have excellent aim." "Yes, sir," Joel said. "Good," Frank said. Now about the northern pasture rotation, and that was the entirety of the conversation. August brought a cattle buyer from Missouri named Harold Greer, who came to the ranch to negotiate the fall sale of 80 head of Harlan cattle, and who was a reasonably sharp negotiator, but not, as it turned out, sharper than Joel, who had spent the preceding 2 weeks studying the current market prices at the Kansas railheads and working out exactly what the bottom and top of a fair price range should look like. He negotiated Frank a price $12 per head above what Greer had initially offered, which over 80 head was a difference that made Frank go slightly pink in the face with pleasure when he did the arithmetic. "Where did you find him?" Greer asked Frank as his buggy was being brought around, with the resigned approval of a man who has been outmaneuvered but can't quite be annoyed about it. "He found us," Frank said, with the comfortable confidence of a man who has stopped being surprised by how well things have turned out. Julia heard the story third-hand from Rosa, who had overheard it from Frank, and she came to find Joel in the barn where he was working with Atlas. She was letting him do some of the horse's basic ground work now, reading the animal's cues, because Atlas had decided to accept Joel as a known quantity sometime around the middle of July, possibly because Joel spent a great deal of time wherever Julia was, and she said, $12 a head, with the tone of someone reporting a wonder. "The market is in our favor right now," he said. "It won't last, but we can use what we make this fall to improve the breeding stock before it shifts, and that will cushion the next few years." She looked at him with that expression that had stopped catching him off guard and now simply made him feel seen all the way through to the back of himself. "You're building something here," she said. "You know that, right? You've walked onto this ranch and you've started building something." "I like it here," he said simply. She stepped closer to him and took his hand. "It likes you back," she said. In the first week of September, Julia found him in the evening after supper with a look on her face that was a different kind of considered, the kind that means a person has been thinking about something important and has arrived at the decision to speak. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to know that I'm asking it only because I want to know the answer, not because I expect any particular one." "All right," he said. "Do you want to stay?" she said. "Here, long-term, not just as Frank's foreman, but here, with me." He looked at her for a long moment, and thought of all the places he had been that had not been home, all the rooms he had slept in and left without a backward glance, all the work he had done that had dissolved into nothing the minute he rode away from it. He thought about the way this ranch looked in the early morning when the mist sat low over the south field. He thought about Clover in her stall and Atlas's progress and the account books that were now in perfect order, and the North Pasture rotation, and Pete's comfortable evenings on the porch and Frank's occasional reluctant smiles and Rose's coffee, and the notes in Julia's handwriting that he kept in his coat pocket. "Yes," he said, "I want to stay." She exhaled slowly, and he realized she had been nervous, which was both touching and slightly astonishing given that he could not imagine her not seeing clearly how he felt. "Good," she said, and her voice was warm, "because I was going to be very put out if you said otherwise." He laughed, and she laughed too, and then he drew her close, and she rested her forehead against his jaw, and they stood in the September evening, while the ranch settled around them into the peaceful end of a long summer's work. He asked Frank for Julia's hand in proper form at the end of September, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, while Rosa pretended to be busy near the pantry and Pete found an urgent reason to walk very slowly past the window twice. Frank heard him out with a stillness that might have been stern and was actually, Joel realized, a man controlling a great deal of emotion, and then he said yes, and then he poured them both a measure of good whiskey that he kept for occasions, and that was all the ceremony they needed between them. Joel had no family ring to offer. He had a modest amount of money saved, and he went to Caldwell and found a jeweler who had a small shop on the east end of Main Street, and he spent a long time looking at what was available and chose a ring that was simple and honest. A thin gold band with a single garnet, the color of certain sunsets over the Kansas plain, because it seemed like the right thing for Julia and for what he felt. He asked her on an evening in early October at the south field fence where Atlas now leaned his big gray head over and watched everything with proprietorial calm. He kept it simple, because she was a person who responded to simple and true. He told her that she had changed the fundamental shape of his life by looking at him and deciding he was worth seeing, and that he intended to spend a considerable number of years doing his best to be worth the looking, and would she marry him? She said yes before he'd quite finished the sentence, and then she said, "That is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me," and she held out her hand, and he put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it in the evening light for a long moment. "A garnet," she said, "it reminded me of." "The sun sets here," she said. At exactly the same moment he said it, and they looked at each other with the particular joy of two people who have discovered that they are so thoroughly in the same mind about something that they have arrived at the same thought through independent routes. And Julia laughed and kissed him right there in the field with Atlas observing approvingly. They were married in November, in Caldwell, in the small church on the west end of town, in a ceremony that was attended by Frank and Rosa and Pete and Cal and August, and by Tobias Henderson and his wife, who had become something approaching friends after the Dunmore business, and by a few townsfolk who had known Frank for years. Julia wore a dress she had brought from St. Louis, deep blue, not white, because she said white was impractical in Kansas, and she was right. And she walked down the aisle with Frank's arm in hers and looked at Joel standing at the altar with the same direct, unhurried attention she had turned on him from across a South Kansas field 7 months ago. He looked back at her without looking away. The minister was a kind, slightly rushed man who was performing 2 ceremonies that day and was trying to be genuine despite his schedule, and he did well enough. The vows they said were the traditional ones, but when it came to the part where they looked at each other and spoke them, they were not traditional in the way they were delivered. They were precise and deliberate and entirely meant, the words of 2 people who did not offer things they did not intend to keep. After, there was a modest celebration at the hotel, and Pete made a toast that was rambling and heartfelt and slightly embarrassing in a way that was entirely endearing. And Frank said almost nothing, but looked at both of them with a happiness so genuine, it was almost painful to see in a face that usually kept its feelings in careful reserve. Rosa cried, which she denied afterward. Joel danced with Julia, who moved well, which did not surprise him, and who rested her head against his shoulder at one point and said quietly, We did this, with a tone of soft wonder that suggested that even she, who was not given to being surprised by her own choices, found something remarkable in the fact that two people had found each other in the improbable wide space of the world and decided to build a life together. We did, he agreed, into her hair. They spent the first winter of their marriage at the ranch, which had the quality of a long, comfortable exhale. The cabin that had been the foreman's quarters was expanded, Frank having instigated a building project in late October that added 2 proper rooms and a real kitchen, in the efficient way of a man who solves problems without making speeches about solving them. It was warm and close and entirely theirs, and Julia arranged it with the practical aesthetic sense of someone who knew what she actually needed rather than what she was supposed to want. The winter was cold but not brutal, and they had prepared well. The cattle were in good condition. The hay stores were more than adequate, and Joel had spent October laying in everything the property would need for the months when the roads to Caldwell would be difficult. He had also, quietly and without telling Julia until it was finished, located and purchased at modest cost the title to the small plot of additional grazing land east of the creek that he'd identified in the spring, and which Frank had agreed was a worthwhile investment from the summer's cattle profits. When he showed her the deed, she looked at it and then at him. "You've been planning this since April," she said. "Since May," he corrected. "April I was still figuring out the water access issue." She shook her head slowly, but she was smiling. "You're extraordinary," she said, with a blunt simplicity that embarrassed him pleasantly. "I'm practical," he said. "Joel," she gave him the look. "You are extraordinary. I need you to know this about yourself. You do not have to be invisible anymore." He met her eyes and held them, and felt the truth of what she was saying settle into him differently than it had in previous months. Not with the provisional, careful quality of something he wasn't sure he was allowed to accept, but with something quieter and more permanent, like the deepest sort of knowing. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, satisfied, and went back to reading the deed. Spring came around again in 1883, and Atlas, fully trained and everything Julia had predicted he'd be, was put to work as a cutting horse in the spring cattle work, and proved himself remarkable fast and level-headed and possessed of an apparently instinctive understanding of what cattle were about to do before they did it. Julia rode him herself most days, and the sight of them working together had the quality of something that had found its proper form, 2 beings so well suited to each other that they made the work look effortless. Pete announced in March that he was planning to marry a widow in Caldwell named Mrs. Elsa Crane, and the news was received with the uncomplicated delight of people who like someone and want good things for them. Mrs. Crane came to the ranch for supper shortly thereafter and turned out to be a compact, warmly sardonic woman who got along immediately and easily with Julia, and told Frank within 10 minutes of meeting him that his vegetable garden was planted too close to the fence, and he was going to lose half of it to the rabbits, which Frank said was probably true. She and Pete were married in April, and Pete moved into Caldwell while remaining on at the ranch, riding out each morning in a state of visible domestic satisfaction that the other hands regarded with respectful amusement. Joel was in the small office he'd made in the corner of the foreman's cabin in late April, going through the spring accounts and projecting the summer cattle figures, when Julia appeared in the doorway with an expression he had not seen on her face before, which was a combination of certainty, slightly nervous anticipation, and a luminous quality like someone has lit something inside a room and it's showing through all the windows. "I think I need to tell you something," she said. He put down his pencil. "Tell me." "I believe we're going to need that extra room we talked about," she said. "Eventually. By November I would estimate, though the estimating isn't precise just yet." He stared at her for a moment, and then the meaning of what she'd said resolved into clarity and something moved in his chest that was so large he didn't have an immediate word for it. "Julia," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood up and crossed the room and took her face in his hands, which was the thing she had done for him on the evening he'd told her he loved her, and it was the right gesture, the completing one, and she leaned her forehead against his. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Terribly," she said, which surprised him until she added, "in the way that makes me feel very awake, very present, like the world has sharpened into something real." He felt his throat tighten with the recognition of his own words given back to him, and he kissed her forehead, and then she pulled back to look at him, and they were both smiling with the particular helpless quality of two people in the grip of something enormous and entirely good. Frank was told that evening and sat very still for a moment and then said, "Well," and then said it again more quietly, and then got up and found the good whiskey and poured 4 glasses without asking whether Rosa wanted one, and Rosa took hers and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. The summer was full and warm and progressing steadily, and Joel worked the ranch with the additional energy of a man who is building something he has decided to believe in without reservation. He hired a 5th hand, a quiet young man of 20 named Samuel who had come looking for work with the manner of someone who expected to be turned away, and was mildly astonished to be taken on, which Joel recognized, and which informed how he managed the hiring. He made sure Samuel knew from the first day that his work was seen and valued, because he knew, with the precision of personal experience, what it cost a person to do good work in silence for too long. Julia continued working with the horses through the summer, adapting her routines as her pregnancy advanced with the pragmatic flexibility of a woman who had decided that being with child was a condition of her life rather than a suspension of it. Though Joel noticed she was more careful with Atlas, more deliberate, less given to the occasional ambitious flourish that had always made him slightly hold his breath, and he loved her for both the caution and the self-awareness that produced it. They talked about names on the evenings they walked down to the south field, which had become a habit long after the habit's original occasion had passed. The conversation ranged freely and pleasantly over possibilities, and they argued the merits of various names with the equal investment of two people who have not yet divided the world into things that belong to one of them and things that belong to the other. "What about your father's name?" Julia asked once. "Raymond," Joel said. He thought about it. He wasn't a bad man. He was just a man who loved one of his sons more than he could afford to love both. "I'm not sure I want to carry that name forward," Julia nodded. She didn't argue or offer comfort she hadn't been asked for. "What about your grandfather, or someone you actually admired?" "There was a man on one of the drives," Joel said slowly. "An older man, a trail boss named Elias who treated every man on the drive like he mattered. He said once that a herd moves as well as the least valued man in the crew. I thought about that for a long time." "Elias," Julia said, trying it. "I like that." "What about a girl?" he said. She smiled. "Clara," she said. "It was my grandmother's name. She was, from everything my father told me, a woman who took absolutely no nonsense from anyone and grew the best kitchen garden in 3 counties. "Clara," he said. "Yes." In November of 1883, Julia gave birth to a boy. They named him Elias Frank Warren, the middle name chosen without discussion, simply simultaneously, which happened to them more than it probably should have. He was pink and loud and possessed of an extremely decisive opinion about his immediate circumstances, which Joel thought boded well, and which the ranch doctor who came out from Caldwell said was a very healthy sign for everyone concerned. Frank Harlan held his great-nephew for approximately 30 seconds before his face did something complicated, and he handed the baby carefully back and went outside and stood in the November wind for a few minutes. And when he came back and his eyes were red-rimmed, and his expression was the careful nothing face of a man who has been moved past his own defenses and is making his peace with it. "Hello," he said gruffly, to baby Elias, in the tone of a man making a formal introduction. Joel stood beside Julia while she held their son, and looked at his family, and thought of all the years of being overlooked, all the rooms where he had been present and invisible, all the mornings he had risen before dawn for ranches that never quite registered his name. He thought of a woman across a field, turning her head and looking at him without looking away, and deciding he was worth the seeing. He reached down and took Julia's free hand where it lay against the blanket, and she looked up at him with those shifting hazel eyes that had been the first thing to make him feel genuinely visible, and she squeezed his hand once, firmly and warm, and he squeezed back. Little Elias made a small, emphatic sound and waved one tiny fist at the general situation, which they both took as agreement. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was the sort that tested everything. A cold that came early and stayed late, and buried the Kansas prairie under a weight of snow that the cattle found entirely objectionable, and the horses regarded with varying degrees of indignation. Joel had prepared well. The hay stores he'd built up through the summer were more than sufficient, and the north barn where most of the cattle sheltered had been re-insulated in October, following a recommendation he'd made to Frank in September based on the look of the sky and the feel of the air, and a deep familiarity with what Kansas winters could produce. The cattle came through with only minor losses, which was a considerably better outcome than several neighboring properties, and the Henderson Ranch in particular sent a rider over in January to quietly ask if the Harlan operation had any hay to spare, which they did, and which Joel provided at cost without trying to make anything out of Henderson's difficult position, because that was how he thought things should work between neighbors. Julia recovered from the birth with the efficiency of a woman whose body had been well prepared, and who was determined to be functional again as soon as reasonably possible, though Joel and Frank, and particularly Rosa, held a united and occasionally heated front on the question of what reasonably possible meant during a Kansas winter with a newborn. She was back in the paddock with Atlas by February, though she was sensible enough to keep it to ground work in the cold, and she had the baby strapped warmly to her chest in a carrier Rosa had made, which meant that Elias spent his first winter watching a cutting horse learn ground manners from a vantage point approximately 2 feet off the ground. "He's going to ride before he walks," Pete predicted at supper, looking at the baby with the benevolent interest of a man who had recently become a stepfather to 2 of Mrs. Crane's older children and was still pleasantly surprised by how much he enjoyed the experience. "He'll walk first," Julia said firmly, "in the correct order." As it happened, Elias walked at 11 months, which was early, and was on a horse in front of his mother, very securely, at 14 months, which was perhaps slightly ahead of schedule. He appeared to feel entirely at home in both situations, which Joel said simply proved that Julia and Atlas between them had established a very persuasive argument for what the world was like. Spring of 1884 brought the completion of a project Joel had been quietly managing through the winter months: the formal registration of an additional 500 acres of land adjacent to the Harlan property, purchased through a combination of the profits from the previous 2 autumn cattle sales, and a careful arrangement with Frank that recognized Joel's central role in the ranch's improving fortunes. The land was titled jointly to Frank Harlan and Joel Warren, with a deed arrangement that Frank's lawyer in Caldwell had drawn up, and which made explicit that the property and its management would pass in due course to Joel and Julia and their heirs. Frank presented the signed deed at supper with the studied casualness of a man who has been looking forward to a moment, but is not going to make it bigger than it needs to be, which was his particular and effective form of tenderness. Joel looked at it for a long moment and then looked up at Frank. "This is more than I expected," he said. "It's what makes sense," Frank said. "The ranch has doubled its value in 2 years since you arrived. It made sense when Julia was planning to stay, and it makes a great deal more sense now that you're here and the boy is here and there's a future to be built." He picked up his coffee cup. "Besides," he added, "I'm 63 years old and I need to know the land is in good hands. It's in good hands." Joel thought of his father's ranch, left entirely to a brother who lost it in a year and a half. He thought of all the work that had been done and then been nothing, all the presence that had registered as absence. He thought of the particular and specific shape of this place. The south field, the creek, the north pasture, the barn with its properly supported beams, the horses in their stalls, the accounts in their perfect order, little Elias asleep in the next room. He thought of Julia at the supper table with her elbows resting on the wood, looking at Frank with the steady gratitude of a woman who does not perform her feelings, but has too many of them right now to contain. "Thank you, Frank," he said. "Eat your supper," Frank said. By the summer of 1884, Atlas had begun his second and third seasons as a working cutting horse, and was developing a reputation in the region as something genuinely exceptional. And Julia had quietly become the person that neighboring ranches consulted on the question of difficult horses, a consultancy she conducted with unpretentious expertise and a flatness for excessive payment that made people trust her and come back. She had also, with Joel's encouragement and assistance with the legal paperwork, begun to maintain a small selective breeding program with Atlas as the primary stud, with the aim of producing 2 or 3 foals a year of similar quality and temperament. Joel continued to manage the ranch's operations with the quiet, comprehensive thoroughness that had become his established signature, and which had the interesting property of making everything look so natural and inevitable that occasional visitors sometimes failed to realize how much deliberate skill and effort underpinned the result. Frank had long since stopped being surprised by this, and had started with age-softened candor, pointing it out when he felt like it, which Joel bore with the slightly embarrassed grace of a man who is still, after everything, somewhat unused to credit. He was 28 years old in that summer of 1884, and he had, in the past 2 years, undergone a transformation that was not visible in his face or his bearing, but was entirely legible to anyone who knew him well. He took up the same amount of space in a room that he always had. He spoke at the same measured pace. He still arrived before sunrise and still said what he meant without ornamentation. But there was something settled in him now, something that had previously been held in careful tension, as though he'd been waiting without knowing what he was waiting for. The waiting was done. He was here. He had been seen. He had been found worth the seeing and had found the same in return, and everything had rearranged itself around that central fact into a configuration that felt, for the first time in his life, entirely like home. In late August of 1884, on a Sunday evening when the heat had finally begun to moderate, and the first suggestion of autumn was in the air, Joel and Julia walked to the south field after Elias had been put down for the night under Rose's affectionate supervision. Atlas came to the fence as he always did, and Julia rubbed his nose, and he accepted it with the dignified condescension of an animal who knows very well how excellent he is. The sun was going down in the west in the extravagant way of Kansas sunsets, all blood and amber and long gold light pouring sideways across the grass. "I want to tell you something," Julia said. He recognized the phrasing. He looked at her. She was looking at Atlas with a small, inward smile. "Clara," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "When?" he asked. "March, I think, April at the latest." He stood beside her and watched the sunset pour its extraordinary colors across everything they had built together. This field and these fences, and the land beyond them that was now partly theirs. And he thought about a boy named Elias who was going to have a sister in the spring, and about a woman who had turned her head across a field and looked at him and not looked away, and about the long, strange journey from invisibility to this, to standing in the evening light of a life that knew his name. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "Not this time." She leaned against him, her shoulder against his the way it had been that first autumn evening on the porch, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the sunset together while Atlas stood patient and magnificent at the fence, and the Kansas sky went slowly dark, and the stars came out one by one in the particular way they had out here, the way that made the universe feel very large and very kind. Clara Ellen Warren was born in March of 1885, as Julia had estimated, and she arrived with a marked physical resemblance to her mother and a set of opinions about the world that were audible from the far end of the main house. Elias, aged 16 months, regarded his sister with a scientific curiosity that gradually resolved over the following weeks into a determined proprietary affection that expressed itself primarily through attempting to be in whatever room she was in, which everyone agreed was probably good for everyone involved. Frank, at 64, held Clara with the ease of a man who had now done this twice and knew what he was doing, and he sat in the kitchen chair and looked at her with an expression that had stopped being complicated and was simply happiness, clear and complete. He told her quietly, while no one seemed to be listening, that she had landed in a very good place and he hoped she knew it. Rosa stood at the stove and pretended she hadn't heard a word. Joel sat beside Julia's bed in the early morning while the rest of the house was still quiet, and Julia nursed Clara in the soft lamplight, and Elias had been brought in and was sitting on the bed looking at his sister with the serious expression of a small person taking in new information. The room smelled of the candle and the outside air through the cracked window and the clean linen smell that was always Julia, and Joel had the feeling, the same one he'd had in November of the year before, but deeper now, with more layers, the way a thing accumulates weight with time of a man who has arrived somewhere he never knew he was trying to get to. "Two," Julia said softly, looking at their children, and she sounded the same as she had when she'd said we did this after their wedding, that note of quiet wonder. "Two," he agreed. She looked at him over Clara's head. "Happy?" she asked, the way she asked things, direct and simple and genuinely wanting to know. "So thoroughly," he said, "that I can't quite find the edge of it." She reached her free hand toward him across the blanket, and he took it and held it, and Elias patted Clara on the top of her head with the extreme gentleness of a small boy trying very hard, and Clara made a sound of vague protest, and Julia laughed, low and warm, and Joel laughed with her in the early morning of a Kansas spring, while the sun came up outside, and the prairie lit slowly gold, and everything that had been broken or overlooked or worn down quiet in him had found its way. Improbably and precisely to this, he had spent his whole life being invisible to everyone who mattered. And then Julia Doyle had looked at him from across a field, and she had not looked away, and the man she had seen, the man he had always been, quietly and without audience, had turned out to be exactly the man this life required. Atlas snorted from his paddock, audible through the window, greeting the morning in his dignified way. Clover answered from the barn. The ranch woke up around them with the familiar, beloved sounds of a place that was entirely and irrevocably theirs, and Joel Warren held his wife's hand in the early light and knew, with the settled permanence of a man who has finally, fully arrived, that he would never be invisible again.